for inviting me over here. I'm going to tell you about building a company with $20 million in revenue with a free product. And the main reason I can talk about this is that everything that I've ever started with the intention of making money has failed and lost money. And the only things that I've ever made money out of are things that I didn't expect to get even $1 of revenue out of. So what are you going to learn in this little talk? About enterprise software and selling stuff to big companies. So even if you're not in the software world, I hope that'll be interesting to you guys. 3 ways to make super normal or above average profits. Hazards of venture capital funding if your company is already successful. Different psychologies and how you talk to people. They're either owners of a business or employees of a business. And finally, the mismatch between engineering culture and modern management culture. A little bit about my background. I was born in 1963. The glaciers still covered the Sloan School to a height of about 30 meters. My parents are Harvard graduates who have a Polynesian cargo cultist's level of understanding of technology. And nonetheless, I grew up in Fresno, Maryland, and some of our neighbors were programmers. So I learned to program in 1976 when I was 13 years old. At the time, computers were just limited to the biggest industrial enterprises. Nobody expected software to be that important because to have a computer, you had to be a huge company or a university or a research lab. The internet existed. It was called ARPANET, and without personal computers, there might have been 10,000 users or 20,000 users. They were basically people who had accounts on mainframes as timesharing users. I actually started using the ARPANET or the internet in 1976, which is how I got my current email address at philg@mit.edu. My first real programming job was at age 14. I worked for NASA, Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland, supporting physicists who were analyzing data from the Pioneer Venus orbiter, which encountered the planet in December of 1978 and streaming that data to the Earth. The guys in my office had gone to MIT, so I thought, well, I hated everybody in high school, and I love all these guys in the office, so MIT must be just a fantastic place from a social point of view, and all kinds of great people to meet. So that was just one of a lot of really bad decisions I made as a teenager. I had a passion for internet applications going back to 1984, and I always wanted to build server-mediated systems for collaboration, whether it be a game or a system that let people work together. So one of the early things I built over the weekend was this old space war game from the deck of PDB-1 in the 1960s, and they did across the network version, so you could have 2 players, each on a symbolic service machine, which is the MIT stuff on your own. Personal computer with a big screen and windows and a mouse. It's just like your present-day Dell or Mac, but it cost $100,000. It was the size of a refrigerator and machine room, and there'd be a big cable to your office, so it would run really good. All right. So I started some companies. I was co-founder of some companies at various times to try to make money, and most of them would fail. So I would go in and out of grad school here at MIT. I was a math undergrad and I was electrical engineering and computer science grad student. And I told people the great thing about MIT is that MIT can't go bankrupt. There's always a place for me back here on my startups fail. And I used to say I started 6 companies and buried 5. All right. So the web came along in 1993. The real problem with the stuff I built before, sorry, the web came along in 1990, but I didn't learn about it really until the systems I built, they would work only on Macintosh or only on some Linux machine or only on these Unix systems. So when the web came along, you could make a system that would work with people on any kind of computer. So I really wore out my welcome in the MIT computer science department by calling everybody that Microsoft Office and all other desktop applications would be dead. I think I predicted they would all be dead by the year 2000. I think just yesterday I got an email from Microsoft thanking me for renewing my Office subscription. our department, ECS, was not quite that far behind. But academics, they looked at the web as evil, and user interface capabilities were terrible compared to desktop systems, and even a lot of academics would call hypertext systems. And also the engineering was terrible. How can you build a system where a link code is changed that all the people pointing to that page? So they had all these obvious problems. People rejected. I myself wrote a paper quoting Winston Churchill, we have chosen shame and we have war. That was the name of my paper. And I said, but this language, HTML, it gives you very bad formatting capabilities. You can't put a caption on your photo. At the same time, it's not machine readable. Computer programs can't tell the difference between an article about blue jeans and an offer to sell a pair of blue jeans for $85 without full artificial intelligence. I said we needed a markup language. Context and representation. Eventually, that came along as we call RDF, which is so complicated. But, anyway, I had to leave MIT actually. I started hanging out in New York at Hearst Corporation because nobody at MIT wanted to hear about the web. And Hearst Corporation, they're a publisher of a lot of different magazines and newspapers, and they have radio stations and TV stations. And I was the architect of all of their internet infrastructure. So we launched our first e-commerce site on the same weekend as Amazon.com. You couldn't go and buy e-commerce packages or advertising servers or user tracking systems. So instead of today where you might cobble together commercial or open source systems, we built everything. I supervised a handful of programmers, and collectively we built rudimentary versions of everything that modern web publisher or e-commerce merchant would use today. At the same time, I was building a website called Photo.net. So I had published this book, which you now have on your table, I hope. How was this snap? Actually, that was a product also of the difference of people at MIT of what I was doing. They said this whole web thing is dumb. And they wouldn't fund me for the summer, so I took the summer off, drove to Alaska and back, wrote a book about it, and published it on the web with pictures. It was the first heavily photo-illustrated websites. And I led all these people emailing me with questions about the photos. So I published a little article on how to take pictures and then generated more questions because it's an open-ended subject. I built a question and answer form where people could see my answers to existing questions and figuring out how to stop the flood. And then I had the ability for people to register and answer each other's questions, and then this online community accidentally developed out of something that I started. I didn't even want to have an online community. I didn't want to do it as a business. In 2007, I'll talk about that later. The thing that I started in 1993, which everybody told me this is stupid. Why are you putting your time and energy into this? You're not doing advertising on the web. You're not charging a subscription fee. You're never going to make any money. And I said, well, look, I'm using MIT servers. I'm using MIT's network. It's not costing me anything except for my time. I don't need to be making money every minute or every day. And then we finally sold it in 2007 for about $6 million. People said, Phil was a genius. He knew what it is. All right. So I was really busy building a company. I was giving away the source code behind Photo.net to help other people do similar things as they want to build an online community about home query and some French literature. And that was taking up a lot of my time. That company kind of grew like a weed, which I'll talk about. Also, Photo.net had a lot of users. Meanwhile, I was trying to finish my PhD, and the professors in the department were asking me, they're doing AI and some other rest of it. So there's a guy named Edward Tuffy, I don't know if any of you guys have read his books. He was an early Photo.net user. And he would tell people he hated the web for a lot of reasons. People in his seminars and he publishes all these books on how to present information. People would say, well, come on, there must be something good on the web. It's like, well, Photo.net's okay. Check out Photo.net. So we began talking, and I told him about my travails. And he was like, oh, it's just a union card. Get your union card stamped. Just take the book. I began, unlike the folks, some of them who were friends of mine who built Amazon.com and other early sites, they were so busy running their businesses, keeping their servers up. They didn't your product requirements, assembling, and the thesis stuff. So the Media Lab inspired me actually because all these grad students who are not technical, they have a big idea of like how to stuff the internet on this computer. Undergrad in electrical engineering and computer science department, all the work. They had to write it up. So I thought, well, if you don't have to do any of the work, you get an MIT PhD in Media Lab. Why do I have to do any work to get my PhD? So I hired an undergrad. I said, look, just get me finished. Like, sure, just take the stuff that's on my website, the stuff that's going into this book, and I turn in the thesis, get it signed. So she would call me, oh, I don't know where this figure should go, like this figure in the book, it should go on this page, this page. I don't care about it, do whatever you want. So after about 3 of those phone calls, she stopped calling me. She walked around, she got the professors to sign it, she got a deposit in the library. I got my PhD from MIT without ever having seen my thesis. I still to this day have never seen it. All right. 3 ways to make money. Who's here from Italy? Okay, so in Italy, as I recall, they say the 3 ways to make money are you can inherit it, you can marry it, or you can steal it. But how do you beat the S&P 500 in the business world? So I think the 3 ways are you can have a lower cost of capital than anyone else. This used to work in the old days when interest rates were 10%. But if your parents were super rich, now you have a lower cost of capital. You can be smarter than everyone else. This is the MIT way to do it. You know how to build something that nobody else knows how to build. And you can the 3rd way is you can understand customer needs better than everyone else. So as I alluded to, in an environment with 0 interest rates, near 0, it's very tough to have a lower cost of capital than your competitors. Me?
Yeah, sorry. I'm going to try to make sure it's recording, sorry.
Okay. Being recorded twice. Okay. A lot of MIT spin-offs work from the principle of being smarter than everybody else. And sometimes it does work. Go back to the Media Lab, for example, they have that e-ink display technology that found its way into the Kindle. But the segue is a much more common situation where even if you get it to work, that was supposed to revolutionize personal transportation, and it just wasn't a market for it. And in fact, that's actually a success. Usually, when it works in the lab, it's really great. There's not much of a market for it. Well, what about understanding customer needs? SAP, the accounting toolkit company, they were started by a couple IBM executives who worked with customers for 5 to 10 years on accounting systems. And they just understood the problems of manufacturing companies and big companies that need accounting systems better than almost anybody else. So when they built their solution, it was a great one, not because they were better programmers than anyone else in the world, because they knew the customer and the problem better. So that's actually how I did it. I running Photobot myself, and I understood the problems of being an online community operator and publisher better than any other programmer on the planet. So I actually built better software than people I brought in. All of us, by operating an online community, we did a better job. So for example, the commercial systems that were competing with us, they had systems that would let one person moderate all the discussion for posters. And that didn't work. It's that like Photolab, we had 100,000 users with no revenue source. So I needed to push the moderation responsibility out to delegates, to volunteer users. So our software had that feature, whereas Microsoft didn't. All right, let's talk about enterprise software. How do we make money out of this Photo.net software that we're giving away for free? So let's talk about enterprise software first. So a lot of you guys have computers here. It runs on your desktop, on your computer. It's desktop software, things like Microsoft Excel. If a company buys it for use by multiple employees, it's probably enterprise software. So the Oracle relational database management system is a good example of that. SAP is a good example. Almost everything that's now done on the web was done in the 1980s by groups of employees. So you have people typing in a PC, and whatever they type gets reflected into a centrally maintained database. We didn't use the web protocols because those web protocols weren't developed until 1990. The basic idea was the same. The early enterprise software could have been free with the mainframe, or it could have been rented on a monthly basis along with the mainframe. some point between the 60s and the 90s, it became kind of conventional to charge a license fee for the develop software initially, and then they charge annual support and service fees. So you pay for upgrades and bug fixes. You pay for the ability to call these people up if something wasn't working, pay for training, pay for customizations if you need features like SAP, just that work out of the box. There's a form that needs to be implemented or installed. So once the customer was acquired, you have this annuity. So I said, well, what if we're solving a big company's problem? Do we really need this license fee? Let's just take the annuity. Let's take the other stuff. And that's a popular way to do business now. Where you give away software, but you sell support. But in the 90s, it was new. So again, I gave away the software mostly because I just hate to see people, duplicate my effort, repeat my mistakes. I'd love to tell you that I, conceived this business structure, because I was so prescient. But actually, I hung up on the first 5 customers. I mean, a typical conversation would be a big company calls, "Hey, Philip, we love that toolkit of yours." We called it the Ars Digita Community System. It was like pig Latin for digital art. The company ultimately was called Ars Digita. So I said, well, great. I'm glad you like it. And they say, well, but we need these 5 extra features. I'd say, well, you got the source code. I give you the documentation. Have your IT department make those. They say, no, we need you to do it. I'd say, how many programmers do you have? 2,000. I'd say, you got 2,000 programmers. I'm just one person. Why do you want me to do it? They say, well, they're all busy. I said, I'm busy too. I'm trying to finish my PhD. So, and that would take me, a whole month to do all that stuff that you're asking for. And they said, we'll give you $100,000. I said, you'll give me $100,000 for a month of work? So ultimately, I began assembling a team of programmers, and I thought, look, this is just a service business. I don't want to be skimming off my friends. These are all my friends. So we'll just have kind of a consortium, and then a company will hire us individually as 1099 consultants. Well, the first customer was Oracle Corporation itself. And they said, look, we're constantly being hassled by the IRS about this 1099 W-2 thing, whether somebody's a consultant or an employee. So we just won't hire individuals. So you have to be a corporation or an LLC. So I started an LLC called Ars Digita LLC. All right, so dealing with these Fortune 500 companies like Oracle, if you fight them on their own turf of lawyers and purchase orders and paperwork, you will definitely lose. And I had a philosophy of anything they sent us, I would sign, basically. I would just look through the 50-page contract and try to see if there was a line where they somehow could get hold of our intellectual property, where they were going to, where we were going to transfer ownership of the software to them. And I tried to make sure that anything that we did that was reusable, we could put back into the toolkit. But other than that, I just ignored everything else. I figured if they're happy, they're going to pay us. If they're not happy, they're not going to pay us. And the rest of these 50 pages are irrelevant because we don't have anything that Oracle or HP or Siemens would want. They're not going to sue us. So let's just sign it, take their money, make them happy, get them to pay us some more. What's the opposite way? A friend of mine, great software engineer, also has an MBA from the world's finest business school. Right here, I'm sure you all know that's MIT Sloan. Anyway, so he's a great guy. He and some friends, I don't know how many are programmers, but Microsoft Active Server Pages was the first popular system, I think, that let you intermix an HTML markup language with little bits of computer program in the Visual Basic language or some other languages. Okay, so Neil, he had this great idea, he and his friends, of just turning HTML into a programming language. So the HTML syntax has the less than and greater than sign. So they would just add these extra tags that were things like a loop or a function call or something right inside HTML. So you had this code. It didn't really escape into computer programming language. It was a computer programming language. It would be interpreted on the server, and then finally the browser would get a regular HTML page. So this was probably 1994. This was a couple years before Active Server Pages was launched, and maybe 3 years before Microsoft. I think it was acquired by Microsoft in 97 maybe and pushed out the door. So it was very early. It was a good idea, and it is kind of the
It's more or less the popular way that people build web pages today with things like PHP or active server pages. So he had a potential customer of Baby Gap, so the Gap's baby arm. And Neil was a pioneer also in using digital photography, of having electronic, scanned pictures of kids or scenes turned into digital postcards, or in this case, a beautiful electronic sort of baby book and baby announcement. So he had this deal going with the Gap. And the Gap, they have all these lawyers, so they gave him this contract that said they have the right to take the source code and use it on some other website. And he had hired a lawyer, and they were getting into this big fight about whether the Gap could, without paying him, use the software somewhere else. They said, there's only 5 programmers in the whole world that know this new language you've created. There's not a chance in a million that they're going to use this software without paying you to customize it. So just sign the contract, take their money. And it finally fell apart. I mean, eventually the person at the Baby Gap who wanted this thing got promoted or transferred or fired or something. Anyway, this person was gone, and the whole deal fell apart. So don't fall into that trap. Get your foot in the door with that big company and just get their money. All right, so things that worked at our software company. So we had this Ars Digita LLC. I knew that I wasn't a great manager. And I knew that we didn't have sort of big company type cost accounting and middle managers and all that other stuff. So I thought, well, how does McDonald's do it? They just say, look, each restaurant, the people running that restaurant have profit and loss responsibility. So I just pushed the P&L responsibility down to the individual programming teams. So there were 2 or 3 programmers, let's say on the HP project. If we're getting $100,000 a month from HP, I know that we're profitable on that project because 3 people don't cost $100,000 a month. And those people were completely responsible for keeping HP happy, keeping the checks coming in, selling them the next project. It was very easy to operate the business that way. There's only one great book on software engineering and software project management. It's called The Mythical Man Month by Fred Brooks. It's about the IBM System 360 project back in the 1960s. And 2 big takeaways from the book are that a big software system should have only 1 or at most 1 software architect and an assistant. And that's because if 10 people design something, it's going to reflect 10 different minds, and it's going to be inconsistent. Whereas if 1 person designs something, maybe it's not the best design in the world, but at least it will be consistent. So my co-founder, Jin S. Choi, a Korean-American guy, C-H-O-I. Jin Choi and I were basically the 2 architects of the system, and we just, anytime a code came into the toolkit, we made it conform to our ways of doing things, and we simplified or killed a lot of ideas. Okay, so one big problem with our system was very similar to SAP. When you have a database application, you have database tables in the Oracle system, and then you have computer programs like web pages or web scripts that pull stuff out of the database tables and write stuff into the database tables. So let's say you're customizing the toolkit for a company that needs some new piece of information stored. You have to add a column to the table, and then you have to change all the scripts to read that column or write that column. Well, what if there's a new version of the toolkit a year later that the customer wants to adopt because it has improvements in some other areas? Well, now you have to go, if you adopt that new toolkit, you have to reapply all those changes. And so some of the young programmers that we'd hired, they were MIT grads, could solve any problem. They said, well, we're going to have this API in the middle, and you'll talk to the API about what changes you need, and you'll never have to go to the tables, and it'll be really easy. And I would say, look, SAP hasn't solved this problem. An SAP upgrade could take a year or 2, and it costs millions of dollars. And SAP, they have infinite money. They have a lot of smart programmers. And if SAP hasn't been able to solve this problem, then I'm not going to pay you to work on this problem for even 1 hour. I'm not going to let you spend any time on this problem. I just squash them. No, you can't do that. So we grew the company by having these distributed teams to about $20 million a year in revenue, and about $7 million of that was profit, although we paid out to avoid corporate taxes in the US, which are the highest in the world. We just paid out a lot of that profit to employees as bonuses, so it was only taxed once. All right, what about venture capital funding? Why did we have venture capital funding? I had funded it myself with my credit card, buying servers from Sun Microsystems. I guess the best way to look at it is people weren't happy making crazy money for doing some pretty easy work. I try to instill in programmers that the end user was sacred, and the end user, we should build web pages where even if they're on a dial-up link, it's worth their while to have downloaded. So the end user, we had like a doctor's professional responsibility to the end user and also to the customer. And so we were doing useful work, and we were getting paid what I thought was crazy money. We'd have young programmers making a $200,000 a year income with a bonus if they made a customer happy. And then people would say, no, we want to make infinite money by doing nothing. So like, well, how do you do that? Oh, well, we'll go public like all these other people. So we went to the underwriters, and they said, well, look, we don't want to take you public. And I said, well, why not? We got more revenue and profit than any of the last 10 companies you've taken public. And they said, well, we don't like to do any due diligence. We don't like to look at your product, talk to your customers, and see if your company is legitimate. I said, well, how do you decide which companies to take public? They said, oh, well, we just look to see if there's a name brand venture capital firm behind them. And if Kleiner Perkins has invested in this company, then we just take them public without any kind of scrutiny. It's like, oh, okay. This was '99, remember? So we find out how that worked. So we said, well, I guess we need venture capital. And I also thought, I was afraid of our competitors. Microsoft had this thing called SharePoint, which was kind of marketed to do the same stuff as we were doing, an online community, although it was primarily intended for employees within a company. And I thought, well, Microsoft, they have a lot more money, they have smarter people, they have more people. Eventually SharePoint 2.0 will come out, and it'll be way better than what we can do with our limited team. And these other competitors, they had raised $50, $100, $200 million in the public market. I said, well, their products are terrible, and they're cumbersome, and you'd be better off just starting out with a bare Windows server and using active server pages from scratch. But they can't waste $200 million. Eventually, they'll have a really good product, and they say they're in this niche. So I was afraid. And that was a totally misguided perspective. My friend Cleantes is a gun nut, and he says, most gunshot wounds are self-inflicted. So basically, that's absolutely true. We had our niche. Nobody's in that niche. 16 years later, the product that we were making could still be sold. And actually, it is still being used, essentially, in a sort of revised open source version. There are similar things. WordPress is probably the closest system to what we were building. But what's different about it is if you want to do e-commerce with the Ars Digita community system, we had one e-commerce module that everybody used and everybody extended if they needed to. And a programmer from project A could be immediately transferred to project B and would know how to maintain and fix that system. Whereas in WordPress, if you want to do e-commerce, I bet you'd find there's 25 different add-ins, and you get to pick whichever one you think is the best. Well, that means every installation of WordPress that does something beyond just the blog is going to be completely different. So anyway, how did we choose a VC firm? Because we did want to go public. So I had a couple of MBAs. I kind of believe that if your car breaks down and you're a math major, you let the MIT mechanical engineering people get out of the car and try to fix it. You don't fix it yourself. So we had 2 MBAs working at the company. One from Harvard, one from Tuck, nobody from Sloan. So I let them pick. We've been having a hard time hiring people. In 1999, all the good people had jobs with prestigious companies, venture capital backed, or big companies like General Electric. So these guys picked some venture capital firms with a good track record at hiring or building companies. At least they advertised, look, we're good at young companies, we're good at bringing in teams, building the teams. This was a huge mistake. VCs, Summit, there's a venture capital firm called Summit around here that they just told us, look, we can't help you with that. You guys know how to run a business. We don't know how to run a business. We know how to get money from institutional investors. If somebody calls us and says they want a job as the VP of marketing, we'll pass their name on to you. But basically, we invest in profitable companies, and then we're going to rely on you to run it. whereas the other VCs are, we're going to solve all your problems. And I was tearing my hair out. I was working 80 hours a week, repeating myself. It was great fun when the company was 40 people. We were doing all this work. Nothing ever had to be redone. Nothing ever had to be said twice. But once you get to about 80 people, it becomes kind of a management problem. And I was not a professional manager. So I thought, well, we got to get help. We're growing too fast, and we need this help. All right, so we brought in a couple good VC firms. I think they're still around. One's called Greylock, one's called General Atlantic Partners. And the first hazard you have to deal with is that the people who sell you on the VC firm are not the people who will be on your board necessarily. There's no standard contract provision for a specific person from a VC firm to be on your board. So you get sold by the A team, the people who've been at the VC firm for 15 or 20 years, the people who started and ran successful companies, and you think, wow, this person would add so much to our company, which is true. But that person, remember, is busy being wicked rich. So they've got trips to Davos, they've got Gulf Streams to Aspen to catch, they've got their 5 houses to decorate. So they put on your board somebody else, somebody who maybe joined the firm a year or two ago. So the people they put on our board were smart guys, nice guys, but they had been employees all their lives. So one had been a management consultant at Bain, one had been a mid-level executive at a Wall Street bank. And the psychology, as we'll discuss, is very different from the psychology of an owner. We would have actually been better off with the manager of the Central Square McDonald's on our board, because that is how different it is when you're an owner. If you're an owner, all you care about is the customer. I want that customer. I want her money. I want her to come back. And if the employees are angry with me, or my boss doesn't like me, or somebody, none of that matters. You just focus in on the customer. If you're an employee, your customers can hate you, the product can be late, but if your boss likes you, you can get promoted. You don't have to worry that much about the customer. You say customers are only, I think the Department of Homeland Security says customers are their only priority. Well, I just came through Logan Airport, and it took 2 hours to get from the time we landed to the time we had our bags and we're walking out. And so they say that customers matter to them, but really, if they can follow the rules and keep their boss happy, they'll still have a paycheck tomorrow, regardless of how people like us feel about the experience. Okay, the other risk, the biggest risk for a successful company is the common preferred split. So this is something I didn't really appreciate. So I had a business that I was the majority owner of with 20 million in revenue. So how much is that worth? What do you guys think? A business with 20 million in revenue and 7 million in profit. 5 times more, okay, 100 million, some multiple of revenue, okay? So maybe it's worth at least 20 million. We can agree on that, right? Okay, if it falls to 10 million, if revenue falls to $10 million, how much is it worth? Okay, 100 million, 50 million, 10 million, it's still worth something. But if you get investors who put in, as we took, $38 million, the day the company's overall value dips to $37.99999 million, the common shares now become worthless. So it turns the shares of the company that you own into essentially an option. Because the preferreds, if they put in X dollars, they get back the first X dollars. So be really careful about that. Now some VCs, I wasn't listening carefully enough. Some VCs, because of that, in trying to sell you, if you have a successful company, the VCs come to your door. And it's almost not worth going to VCs until they're coming to you. That's my opinion. They have infinite time to hear presentations and watch decks. But if they're actually knocking on your door trying to get in, then it's worth dealing with them. And they'll say, well, look, you're the founder. We're going to take this company in a radically new direction. VCs like the big score, so they'll do riskier things. They can handle more risk than you can as an individual. And they may offer to give you, like $4 or $5 million for some of your common shares up front. So even if it craters and ultimately fails and the common shares become worthless, you've gotten some money out. So that would be my advice. If you have a successful company, take some money off the table when the VCs come in. All right, so what changes did they make? You've been with me now for, I've been talking for about 40 minutes. You probably already figured out that I'm not the kind of guy you'd want to share an office with or be anywhere near in a company. Well, the VCs figured that out too. So in about a month. So they had bargained for 2 board seats. The board was supposed to have 7 people, 3 insiders, including the CEO, 2 VCs who could veto some certain decisions like, $1 million purchases or sales of the company, and 2 outsiders. So the VCs just refused to approve any outsiders. I could have brought in Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, and they would have said, oh, he's not qualified to be on our board. And they brought in a CEO that I agreed to. He was a super nice guy. There's an art to making people feel good. You put your arm around them. You talk about how you appreciate what they're doing. I mean, it's an art that I don't have. And he sold me pretty well, too. So basically, once their pet CEO was in there, they now had a 3-2 board. They had 3 votes on the board out of 5. And they had absolute control of the company. And they told me that, like, OK, well, you're out of here. Like, you're going to still come to board meetings, but we're just going to do whatever we want. All right. So what did they change? Initially, I thought, well, look, I'm not a professional business person. I don't have an MBA. I'm a programmer. So maybe they'll do a better job, and I'll get the dividend checks. They changed. They went all in for something called the second system. This is something that the Mythical Man Month talks about. And the System 360 was IBM's second system. They had the first system, which was the mainframe operating system for their old 7090s, 7094s. And they just wrote down a list of 100 things that people didn't like about the old system. And they said, we're going to solve all of these with a new OS 360 that you're going to love. And it was years late, and it was a failure in a lot of ways initially. And Fred Brooks says, it's a mistake to think that the next generation of programmers is going to be smarter than the first one, is going to solve all the problems. So they kind of listened to people, and they just agreed to this laundry list of things. It was going to be way fast. It was never going to need to be, it was going to be trivial to upgrade to a new version. All the problems with the old system were going to be solved. They took the profit and loss responsibility and they hoisted it up exclusively to the CEO. And they told programmers, don't worry about your customer. Don't worry about the profitability of the project. All you have to worry about is reporting to the head of programming. The salespeople, similarly, just don't worry about what you're selling and whether it's going to make sense for the company. You report to the head of sales. They hired these people called client services that I never even figured out what they were supposed to do. But the salesperson wasn't going to talk to the customer after selling, and the customer was going to be shifted, and they weren't going to talk to the programmers. They were going to talk to the client services people, and they reported to the head of client services. We had sold with programmers. I would go give a talk at Caltech to 300 people, an all-day course on how to build websites, how to do SQL. We might get 1 customer out of that. Maybe not somebody who was in the room, but somebody who talked to somebody who was in the room. We published books on how to do stuff. We published tutorials. We published source code, and that's how we got all of our business. They said, well, that's just dumb. You want to sell, you hire salespeople. You get them into a suit. You have them cold call customers and say, hey, you really want a toolkit for building online communities, don't you? And actually, the new VP of sales or marketing, his brilliant idea was to change the company name after 100,000 plus downloads, 10,000 installations worldwide. He said, it's Ars Digita name. It's too hard for customers to spell when the salesman calls them. OK, and they kind of reduced the focus on making the customers and the end users happy in favor of dressing the company up to sort of look better to go public. At board meetings, what's the best looking software company? Well, it's IBM, obviously. So they said, well, we should do everything just like IBM. And I would say, it's hard to compete with IBM doing everything their way when you don't have their brand and their cost of capital. So also remember, most of our customers are these Fortune 500 companies that are already customers of IBM. And if they want something done the IBM way and the IBM speed, they can just hire IBM Global Services to do it. And they hired us because we could get the whole system launched before IBM Global Services, bless their bureaucratic hearts, would have a little notebook of specs for what the system would look like. There's nothing wrong with IBM, but it's a cumbersome beast. All right. So one thing I'll give them credit for. They were right about one thing. There's 2 insights about managing people that I learned. One is there's a book called Bringing Out the Best in People that you guys should all get if you ever become a manager. It's pretty cheap. bringing out the best in people. And it basically says, look, you don't get what you get what you measure, basically, and you get what you reward. It starts from the observations that people don't naturally eat healthy food, and the same thing about management. But the other thing is, I forget who said this, but anyway, people don't remember what you say; they remember how you make them feel. So they remember how they felt. They don't remember what you said. And the MIT tradition of unvarnished technical criticism is really out of place in the modern workplace. If somebody comes to you with a data model, somebody would come to me with a data model, I say, well, look, we could replace these 20 tables in the data model with 3 tables. And that cuts the number of front-end pages that we have to build by a factor of 6, because every table has to have pages to read from it, write to it, edit it, maintain it. That's also going to cut the complexity of the SQL code, because instead of joining 10 tables for a query, you're only going to have to join 2 tables. All right, so how does that make the author of the 20-table data model feel? Well, now, that person feels ashamed and incompetent, even though, I never said you're incompetent. So really, there's an art to saying, look, this is great. The right way to say it, I think, would be something of the form, this is great work. You've captured everything that we need to record in the RDBMS. You've formalized in code everything that's important to the customer. This is wonderful. I just have one little idea, which is to cut the number of tables down a bit. Anyway, I wasn't good at that, and it's an important skill, which I've learned more from teaching helicopter students, actually. I'll talk about that at the end if there's time. There's also the customer-focused example. I remember I was, in that month before I was completely fired, there was one customer who wasn't paying their bills. So we had a little talk. What are we going to do about this customer? And I said, well, how much did they pay? 600 grand. I said, how much did we tell them it was going to cost to get their site launched? 500 grand, 500 to 600 grand. I said, well, is their site launched? No. I said, well, why are we having this meeting? Why wouldn't the meeting be about launching their site? So I got on a plane and flew out to LA, and I talked to the programmers, and they said, we can't launch the site. The customer, they want all these features. They want all this stuff. They need all this stuff before launch. I said, well, look, part of being your job as an engineer is not just to do everything slavishly that the customer says. It's to persuade them that you can launch with, you don't need 20 discussion forums on a site with 0 users. You can start with 1 and add another 19 if it grows to 500,000 users. So basically, that just illustrates, they were interested in getting money because that would look good for the underwriters, that would look good, who knows, to their partners up at the VC firm, and I was interested, and the company had been interested in how does the customer feel about the 600 grand they paid? How do their end users feel about the site that we've built? Okay, consequences of those changes. I was kind of burned out. Like I said, I've been building internet applications for 20 years. I've been working 80-hour weeks. So initially, I was kind of happy that I didn't have to keep doing this and keep nagging people. But the second system syndrome really killed the company. That was kind of the main thing. If you don't have a product that people want to adopt and install, then you don't have anything. And they had told people, look, stop using the, never say this, stop using the old system because the new system is coming out in 3 months. Because guess what? It may be a year before that new system finally does come out. And guess what? It was supposed to be faster, but the most active part of any online community is the discussion forum, and that was literally 100 times slower. You would need a mainframe-sized computer to handle a modest online community. And the first time they installed the new system with a real customer, they had to dig under the APIs that they built and alter an Oracle table. So right there, it was never going to be upgraded painlessly. So the VCs, we were still on board meetings, and they could get a little bit acrimonious, where I would just say, look, the spreadsheet that you've shown has got these 5 errors in the assumptions, so we can't really rely on the rest of it. And they're like, you're injuring our self-esteem, and self-esteem is the most important thing in a company. And eventually, they emailed me a direct threat, saying, we're going to irreparably impair your financial future. So my same friend Neil, the Baby Gap guy, is like, you got to talk to a lawyer. Like, it's time to talk to a lawyer. So I talked to this lawyer. He said, well, look, get together with your co-founders. You still own a majority of the shares. Just vote out their pet CEO. Vote yourselves into the board, and these executive positions, and the VCs will be back to the 2 board seats that they bargained for. I said, well, what's the worst that could happen? He said, well, I could sue you in Delaware Chancery Court. It was Delaware Corporation, saying that somehow you didn't have the right to do this. But he said they'll never do that because VCs will never spend their own money. They will not take money that they got as fees and use it to pay a law firm to go and sue you. They only will spend money if it's their investors' money that they can spend. So what this lawyer didn't count on is that their pet CEO still had control of the company checkbook. So he had the company, write a $1 million check, I think ultimately, to the VC's law firm. And then, I was deposed. I don't want to get into the whole litigation. The only funny part was the lawyer in the deposition asked me, would it be fair to say that you and Mr. Bloom didn't see eye to eye? I said, no. Why not? I said, well, for 2 people not to see eye to eye, they would have to have different ideas. And I never heard Mr. Bloom express an idea. There were about 5 lawyers on the other side. They started, It was all pointless, though. The Delaware judge was like, look, I read these documents. They seem pretty clear to me. And they knew their case was lost because they had their 2 board seats, and that was basically it. So they finally settled. They bought me out. I still had this controlling position basically through all these shares. So I ended up basically, I'd had $80 million worth of stuff on paper at one point. I sold out for $7 million, and I was pretty happy. And the good lesson in here is, they tried to steal control of the company. They could probably have bought it. If they just said, Philip, hey, we'll give you $5 or $7 million, and then, we can stop this fight, I probably would have taken it. 2 more examples of this. Facebook, if you saw the movie, which I'm sure is historically completely accurate, there was this guy named Eduardo Saverin who was a founder of Facebook but never did anything. Okay, and then they tried to get him out with trickery, with dilution and lawyers and accountants and all this other stuff. And eventually, it was all undone. All of these clever maneuvers were undone by a court based on litigation by this guy. Okay. So as it happens, we had exactly the same issue at Ars Digita. So I had started this LLC, and I'd funded it. But I thought, well, we should have a few other owners. It's kind of dumb to have an LLC with just one owner. So I brought in these 5 people I've been working with, and for a few cents, they end up with substantial positions in the company. But 3 of them, I think, never did anything. Yeah, 3 of them never did anything. As soon as the company was formed, they went off to their own companies, or they were busy with other stuff. So it was just like the Saverin situation. So when we had to convert from an LLC to a C corporation because a corporate investor can't be in an LLC, at least not in Massachusetts, for a corporation to invest in another corporation, and the VC firms are at least were corporations or partnerships or something. Anyway, we had to convert to a C corporation. So I called these 3 people up, and I told them exactly what was going on. I said, look, your shares could be worth a lot of money, like hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially. But and I know that you didn't do anything. So how about if you sell your shares back to us? I think it might have been for $20,000. And they all agreed. So I told them what they were giving up, and they agreed. So it worked. I'm not saying that it always would have worked, but at least try. Another example of how you can be sort of reasonable. I was a functional board member of an MIT spinoff company. Because I didn't own it, I wasn't as emotionally invested in the company, and I actually gave a lot better board level advice than I did to my own company. I was a seed investor, and I was on the board for a couple years until the Series A round, the first round of venture capital funding. They had this MBA. I think he was actually a Princeton graduate and a Sloan MBA. It's another example of Sloan. And he hadn't worked out very well. So they wanted to fire him for underperformance, tell him how bad a job he'd been doing, and get rid of him before his 1-year anniversary, because then he would have stock in the company. His stock options would vest after a year. And there was a cliff. If he didn't last a year, then he would get nothing. I said, well, first of all, let's talk about this guy's, is he cheating the company? Is he willfully doing bad stuff, or is he just trying hard and not being effective? And they said, no, he's sincere, he's trying hard, but he's not effective. I said, well, look, you're going to run out of money in 6 weeks. So you don't have to tell him he's doing a bad job. You just have to say, look, we're running out of money, and we have to fire everybody who's not working in the lab directly on the product. So sorry. And I said, look, these shares in 6 weeks could very well be completely worthless. So just give them, take however many, it was 9 months or 11 months. Just take, 9 divided by 48, the 4-year vesting period, and just give them the shares. They might not be worth anything. Okay, well, 10 years later, they actually took my advice. 10 years later, that company is still limping along. There's been a lot of dilution from, it's an MIT thing where they can do stuff that nobody else can do. But of course, nobody needs this thing. So anyway, well, not that many people need this thing. It's a moderately successful company, but the shares, those shares they gave them haven't been worth that much. All right, so what am I doing now? I'm still running a web publishing operation. It's not very successful because Facebook and Google, that Photo.net company that was sold for $6 million, is now definitely worth less than $1 million. Like all the money on the internet is being made by Facebook and Google. Facebook has so many page views that they've devalued a page view. So a site like Photo.net or my personal site or whatever, it's very hard to make money purely on page views. We have a Facebook application, so we're trying to be part of the Facebook thing called postclipper.com. Actually, maybe you can turn on the projector. We'll show a few of these things. One of the things I did after getting fired was I learned to fly. So that was starting in 2001. OK, here's my personal site, modestly titled philip.greenspun.com. Maybe you can bring up postclipper.com also. Yeah, postclipper.com. This is our little Facebook app that lets you make a travel book or an electronic baby book or something out of a subset of your Facebook postings. It doesn't really seem to exist. It grabs the text and the pictures. Actually, my friend Avni is here. She is kind of like the main, one of the main minds behind postclipper. And then you can show photo.net. It's still kind of in its unvarnished 2006 incarnation. All right, so I learned to fly. I teach helicopter students mostly, but also some people who fly higher performance airplanes like business jets. I got roped into some expert witness work. So by publishing all my textbooks and stuff online, I rank really high in Google when a lawyer is helping to defend an IBM or an Amazon from a patent infringement lawsuit. They say, who's a relational database management system expert? Well, guess what? Philip's book on how to program SQL, because I was giving it away for free instead of turning it into a book that could only be found in a bookstore or Amazon, I end up getting those calls. And it can be interesting. It's kind of like solving jigsaw puzzles all day, in that it's pointless. But it pays a lot better than solving cheap jigsaw puzzles. So it's fun. And I'm kind of naturally a little bit combative. So I kind of like working with lawyers and thinking about how are we going to, as an expert, you're supposed to be neutral, and I am, but there's always an element of combat. I now have kids, and I think entrepreneurship, I hope all of you are single and childless. Or you're maybe great at managing your time, which I'm not. Or you don't really care that much. Because if you care, like I did, passionately about the product and the customer, you will be working all the time. There's always something more you can do, some documentation you can write, some features you can add, some bugs you can fix. It's very hard. That's why I'm not doing a startup right now, even though I love, like I said, I love that small team, having 5 people or 10 people or 20 or 30 or 40. Beyond 40, it gets a little annoying. But having a team behind you, you feel like you're flying, you're getting so much work done. But it's hard to do when you have kids and be fair to the kids. All right, so what have I learned from aviation? So if a student is in an unfamiliar machine like a helicopter or an airplane, they kind of have tunnel vision. They can't process a whole bunch of stuff. And only now do I realize that that's what most people are like most of the time. If you say, here's the 15 things that can be improved about your design, they can't process all 15. So in the helicopter, I ignore the 9 things that they're doing that could be done better. And maybe I have dual control, so I may subtly fix some of the stuff. And I talk about the one thing I'd like them to work on right now, the most important thing. And that's an important skill, I think. I used to fly regional jets for Delta until the big collapse of 2008. That was one of my fun experiences, earning $19,000 a year, carrying 50 people around in a Canadair regional jet. So I did this really crummy landing in Toronto, my first couple weeks on the job. We had simulator training, but the simulator training is mostly about instrument flying. It's not about these visual approaches to airports in busy conditions. So I was perfectly lined up on one runway at Toronto, and about a minute before landing, they switched us to a different runway. And if you're a good pilot, you just set the thrust. You anticipate all the power and energy you're going to need for the next minute, and you set the engines appropriately for that, and you don't touch them again. And you barely have to fly the airplane. It's trimmed right. So you can basically just sit there, and the airplane will almost land itself. At the last minute, you might flare it up a little bit. All right, so my landing was the opposite. I was like adding power, taking power out, adding power, taking. It was like a student pilot in a Cessna. I was like, oh, I was just, I wanted to send my pilot certificate back to the FAA. And the guy next to me is younger than I am. He's a captain. He said, well, Philip, nobody was born knowing how to fly a 53,000-pound jet. So I think that was a great perspective, and I try to use that, with everybody that I'm working with, kids. What have I learned from expert witness work? Know when to shut up. The best lawyers in the depots, they get what they need and they remain silent. Obvious weaknesses in your own side's case, just admit them if you're asked. And say, yeah, reasonable people could differ about that one thing. Be as agreeable as possible. Cross-examination. The other lawyer comes up and it's like, isn't it true that this, and isn't it true that that, and isn't it true that that? I just say, yeah, I agree with almost everything that you say. Like, you're absolutely right, except for this one little thing. And then if they say, well, what about this, what about this? I apologize. Oh, I'm sorry if I didn't explain that clearly enough. It's not about fighting a successful conflict. And of course, you're not going to be in litigation, I hope, within your company. But sometimes there are conflicts either with customers. The most successful combatants, I think, are in some ways the most agreeable. That's one thing I learned from expert witness work. All right, so it's just a summary of what we've talked about, and then we'll have questions, discussion. Yeah, the big takeaways I hope you've gotten are when you're dealing with a big company, don't worry about the legal fine points, just try to get their money. Get them to sign the contract, get the purchase order, get their money, and start working. Because there's always more. If you can solve their problem, there's always more money behind it. The easiest way to make a better return on investment than just buying the S&P 500 is to know the customer better than anyone else. You can't be the smartest person in the world, but you can know a market better than anybody else knows it. Watch out for that preferred common split. Remember that once you take in VCs, your common shares become more like a stock option than a stock. They can very easily go to zero if things don't work out quite as planned, or if there's a 2000 style or 2008 style meltdown. Figure out whether somebody's got the employee psychology or the owner psychology before you talk to them, because it's a different language, and if you start telling them, if you just assume that the customer and the end user is the most important thing to that person, and the conversation is based on that assumption, it's not an effective conversation if all they care about is what their boss thinks. And then, like I said, if you're an engineer, keep in mind that constructive criticism is not actually constructive if the person hearing it can't process it. All right. What about, questions?
I'm actually your happy customer, so I actually about you 2000. I learned photography by your tutorials. It's great to see you.
All right.
I have two related questions. Let's talk a bit more about how you got your customers in a sense. How did they discover you, and what sort of positions they have taken in their companies, and how did you manage to maintain positive cash flow even if that was coming from one person up to a point to create that sort of media around you, books and website to get people to know.
Okay. Well, it was a lot. I don't want to disappoint you guys. And the question is how, how do we get those first customers? How do we maintain the positive cash flow? A lot of it was being here. I mean, Americans are learning this to their horror right now. That we thought we were the smartest people on the planet, but it just turned out that we were the first people connected to a lot of this technology, and we're actually not that special. There's plenty of people in other countries that can do great things. But at the time, I was here at MIT, here in the Boston area. So people would call an MIT professor and say, "Oh, we need help with this web thing." And the professor, "Well, I don't know anything about it, but we have this grad student. He's kind of a pinhead, and he's always talking about the web, so you should talk to him." So I got a few leads that way through that MIT community connection. And maintaining positive cash flow, I would just tell companies, I'd say, "Look, we don't have any money. You have to give us some money up front." Just be really honest with these big companies about how, to serve them, we would actually need to front load a little bit of the money so that we could to keep the lights on. But also, most of the customers, they really did come in through the publishing. We had the things that we built were basically the ads for the company, inadvertently. Who else has a brilliant question?
What do you think about some lead time? What would be the lead time to get to know the person you would like to start a business with, like sort of transfer from more or less knowing someone, being friends, when the idea starts growing and you realize that, okay, so this is possibly a way to start a business. So what would be the lead time, and what would be just 3 or 4 questions to ask this person to check if it fits?
This is a great question. Like, how do you get to know somebody before you're going to go into business together, and what's the lead time? I'm going to give you a story about one of my old students from MIT. I was teaching this class at MIT where people break up into teams and then build real systems for real customers and learn about being an engineer instead of just working for an engineer. This guy's had a very successful career, and he was out in Silicon Valley starting a company, and he got together with some partners. I think maybe even through the Y Combinator process, which some of you may have heard of. Anyway, so one of these guys, very well spoken, he had a great resume. They checked his references. One of the references was a Stanford professor who actually talked about this person's performance in his class at Stanford. And the reason this is interesting is because later it transpired that this guy was never a student at Stanford. So everything on his resume was completely fabricated. And he'd somehow gone to this guy's office and said, "Oh, remember when I was in CS 234 with you 3 years ago?" I said, "Yeah, I remember." He had sold all these people, and it was remarkably successful. So I don't think it takes long. I think if you sit down, we used to do a boot camp at Ars Digita where we would bring people in and we would work with them for a couple of weeks. 3 weeks, I think he says, 3 weeks. I think if you work with somebody on a project, the best way to do it is just to sit down and build something together, build something small. I think if you do that even over a 3-week period, you get a really good sense of them. But yeah, I don't have a great algorithm for how to avoid this. I tend to believe people. If I wouldn't even have done that extensive a reference check on that resume. But obviously it wasn't adequate.
What were the consequences, responsibilities you were signing on top of
Yeah, the question is, what constraints do the teams have? Could they sign up to do unprofitable deals? And what kind of controls did I put in as a manager? I guess, I was kind of the main salesperson. That was one of the riskiest things the venture capitalists did was, they got rid of me without having an alternative proven sales mechanism. So as it happens, most of the time when there was a contract to be signed I was involved in it. So they had P&L responsibility for executing the contract, but they didn't really have, they weren't the ones to be able to say, okay, we'll charge you $5,000 a month and we'll build you everything that eBay has. It was more about they had responsibility for executing it and making sure that it went roughly on time and roughly on budget. But like I said, as the company grew from 40 to 80, I stopped managing it when it was 80. More and more of those problems arose where there'd be an unhappy customer and we'd have to send an extra few programmers in to kind of fix something and debug something. And that was one of the things that I didn't like. So I don't have a great answer to that other than, when you're small and you're all working in the same physical office, it's easier. One of the great things actually about this guy, Matt Mullenweg, who started WordPress, he's built a company that's almost completely distributed. And somehow it's good. He also doesn't torture himself with MIT type stuff. I once asked him, one of the hardest problems at Ars Digita, we had all this stuff for email alerts. We were sending out emails, when somebody responded to your discussion forum posting, summaries of stuff, people could register for alerts and everything. We really wanted to have a totally seamlessly integrated web and email system where you could respond to stuff by email. We had a ticket tracking system that Nokia was using for some of their products, where the people trying to solve the problems would be able to email in and it would get added to the ticket. And I said, yeah, but we have all these problems with bounces. Like we tried to achieve full artificial intelligence of reading the bounces that we got back from other mailers and figuring out, is this person temporarily unavailable? Is it a server problem? Has the account been deleted? And then we should when did we mark this email as not effective? And I said, Matt, how did you solve this problem with WordPress? He says, oh, we just send everything to dev null, we don't leave them. And he hadn't even tried, and it was a much more successful product than what we had. So yeah, that's another good example. Pick your fights. So we picked. MIT people are always picking a lot of technical fights that don't need to be picked, which is one reason Unix. MIT had Multics, this operating system, was much better than Unix. And the Bell Labs people were smart enough to realize that most of what the Multics people were doing only mattered to the most demanding customers, like the Department of Defense and the biggest companies. And a system that was greatly stripped down, inspired by Multics, but greatly stripped down, would actually be more successful. How do we go about releasing the software behind Photo.net and the company? So actually, one advantage we had over a company like Microsoft, remember Microsoft would have the product managers, I guess, who would find out from the customer what was needed, and they have the project managers who would tell the programmers what to do, and then the programmers, and then it would go out the door to the testers, and then it would finally ship. So they couldn't really do much in less than 6 months, and probably more like a year. It would take them a year between releases. So we released every month or two, and what we always did was we released off of a running site. So we would take a site like Photo.net that was working, with 100,000 users, and we would actually release the open source code from the running server, so we were sure that it had been given a good hammering, and if there are any real problems, we would have noticed it. From a legal point of view, it was pretty loose, where we were still, Photo.net became its own company. I spun it off to actually Wai-Kit Lau, who is associated with the Bootcamp. Some of you guys may have met him. He was among a group of MIT folks who took over Photo.net as a business, because I was busy running the software company, which I thought had a lot more potential. Actually, in retrospect, that was another really dumb decision. If you look at the data model for the Photo.net photo sharing system was developed in 1999. And if you look at the data model in Oracle, which I had a hand in writing, it has all the features necessary to run a crowdsourced stock photo agency. So everything's in there for a Photo.net member, of whom there were probably at least 50 or 100,000 active ones at the time, to mark a picture as being available for stock, grant certain rights for free, say certain rights would cost money. Everything is in that data model. but we never built the pages, the front-end pages to do it. And Shutterstock, I think, is one of this multi-billion-dollar company was launched about 4 or 5 years later without the user base. I mean, so Photo.net actually was the more valuable business probably than the software company, or at least as valuable. But anyway, it was spun off to these other folks, but I was still a shareholder in Photo.net. So just informally, sometimes we would release from, when we were interested in building more corporate and collaborative features, we would release from our own arsdigita.com, which had a lot of stuff for employees. We had an intranet module where you could keep track of who's an employee, who are the customers, what projects are you working on. And then we were interested in more of the online community stuff we would release from photo.net. But there was no real fancy. We were very light on the whole company, except for the VC transaction. Our total spending on lawyers and contracts and like formalized arrangements was minimal. Probably spent, thousands of dollars on lawyers.
Talk a little bit about the culture of the company. How was that like?
The culture was very similar. Yeah, what's the culture of the company like is the question. The culture was very similar to the MIT Computer Science Lab and AI Lab. Very freewheeling, anybody could say anything to anybody. I built a system, I think I built it myself, where any employee could spam the entire company. They could just go to a web page and type in whatever they wanted and communicate it to everybody. And you could say almost anything to anybody. And there was even, I remember one of the MBAs, there was this guy in the Berkeley office who, when you're in a position of power and management, especially if you're not in the same office, I was in Cambridge, so we had a small office in Berkeley, people can spin a lot of stories about you. I mean, you read the newspaper. I have friends on Facebook, actually, they talk about Donald Trump like he's somebody that they know. This is what Trump is like. And I'm like, well, if you watch professional wrestling, do you imagine that that's the true personality of the people that you're seeing? How do you really know what these people are like? It was the same thing. This guy decided I was I am kind of a horrible person, but he hated me for whatever reason, and he spammed the entire company with this long screed about what an asshole I was, because I'd criticized him. This team had made a customer unhappy. Actually, that was what had happened. They were late, the customer was pissed off, the project wasn't going well. And I said, okay, we got to fix this. And the guy was unhappy about the fix that I had proposed. So he spammed the entire company with this long, angry screed. And the MBAs, these 2 MBAs that were working for me, working for us, they said, you got to fire this guy. I'm like, I'm not going to fire him just because he hates me. I might fire somebody if the customer was super unhappy or if they did something horrible to the customer, but just because they hate me or criticize me, I'm not going to. He actually quit sometime later, but I never had to fire anybody actually. But so that's what I think, we wanted that engineering culture where people could be totally unafraid. People were unafraid to, say, Philip, this whole system is stupid. We got to rewrite it all in Python. And I would be unafraid to say, that is a really terrible idea. Like, if we do anything new, it has to be Java or, these, we were using some tools that were kind of not the most popular. So I said, no, we can't take it further down this obscure road. If we do anything new, it has to be active server pages or Java. So yeah, the culture was, you can say anything to anybody at any time. And that was changed with the VCs, because the MBAs definitely, want to see more respect for people in positions of authority.
Thank you, Phil, for your talk. That was really amazing. I'm interested in this idea that when you said go to a team of 40, that it was like you're flying and you had this tight unit and it felt great and you were making enough money. So why go to 80 and then things kind of fall apart?
Yeah, well, in retrospect, no, I mean, in retrospect, a lot of things could have been done better. One of the tragedies of small companies, if you're Apple or General Electric, you can make a huge number of mistakes and you still have a successful business. You'll only have to do a few things right. At a small company, you have to do almost everything right or you'll disappear. So why go from 40 to 80 well, I didn't know how bad it would be. And part of it was how rapidly we were growing, I think. I don't think growing from 40 to 80 over a 3-year period probably would have worked out fine. Growing from 40 to 80 over a 3-month period, there's not enough time to transmit the company's culture to those new people. So some people may just show up because they want the paycheck. they're not there because they love the customer, they love the end users, and they love the business. But yeah, in retrospect, obviously, that was a dumb idea.
Thank you, Philip, for your talk today.
All right, thanks, guys, for listening. So there should be a book for everybody, and getting the plastic open is an IQ test, which I see some of you have already failed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.